Shall we? Or shall we wait for a couple more minutes? Okay. Today is our third meeting. Most welcome. I think that my today's task is impossible to complete. I'm going to talk about two titans of Russian or Soviet contemporary art. These are two key figures for our history, for the history of our contemporary arts. And I think that every one of them gave birth to a number of different myths that color our history and our reality with a different tone. My today's heroes are extremely talented. And the first person I'm going to talk about is the artist that for many, many years have been thought to be one of the leaders of post-war Soviet contemporary art. That's Ilya Kabakov. He was born in 1933 in Dnipropetrovsk. With evacuation to Central Asia, he moved, and after that he came to Moscow. His dream was to enroll into the art school. This is where his journey began. Very complex, but also exciting journey of rethinking the heritage of the 20th century, rethinking the Russian culture, rethinking the Russian avant-garde. Indrzej Chalupetsky, when describing the Moscow art scene in the 70s, used to say that Kabakov was the first artist in Moscow who had the courage to break the ties with any art conventions, including those of modernism, and take a firm stance in the contemporary world. What did Indrzej Chalupetsky mean there in 1972? We'll try to understand it in the course of our today's lecture. Upon graduating from the Surikov Institute as a graphic artist, Ilya Kabakov, like many others, like Eric Bulatov, like Vladimir Yankelevsky, and many other artists, was trying to find his way in art. Of course, he had a strong academic background. He got a very good training from one of the best Soviet schools. He also had some information about the Western art, although it was not full, of course, and it never actually matched what he was taught at the academy. He, as well as other contemporary artists, had to rethink their own background. They had to come up with their own path in art. They had to find their own artistic language. And again, like many artists of the same generations, Ilya Kabakov decided to look for secrets of mastery, learning from his predecessors, including Robert Falk. He thought himself to be his student. In front of you, you can see his self-portrait executed in post-Cézanne-ish Falkian style. I think this is the last time he turns to the Moscow painting school. At that time, Ilya Kabakov was in the middle of rethinking the foundations of his art. He deliberately divided his life into two uneven parts. The first part, as he describes it in his memoirs, is the life for them, as he described the external Soviet world, which was quite aggressive and quite demanding to artists. For them, Ilya Kabakov works as an illustrator for children books. He collaborates with Dead Geese, with a publishing house that specialized in books for children. He worked on a huge number of publications. And he did not only do covers, sometimes he also did other works. Vladimir Yankelevsky, for example, made his money making covers exclusively. Ilya Kabakov also collaborated with magazines, including Murzilka and others, and he also illustrated the books that were published in huge editions, thousands of copies. From this work, he used to get quite a big fee, and that allowed him to keep working for himself too, despite all of the financial struggles. But in mid-60s, he was quite well off. Working as an illustrator in books for children actually guaranteed some financial stability. He did not have to think too much about making his living. He also had enough money to have his own workshop, which he opened in mid-60s on the Stretinsky Boulevard. Ilya Kabakov moved there in 67. The fees were enough to buy a car and to buy an apartment in one of the new houses near the Rechnoy Vokzal metro station. Unlike the first heroic generation of nonconformist artists, the second generation of contemporary artists actually were better off financially. Their social status was much more stable. They had all the goods that the Soviet state could offer. Ilya Kabakov was not just a successful illustrator, he was also a celebrity. He got a number of awards for his illustrations and for his design. He is loved by his management, he is loved by his audiences, but he invests most of his time into what he called his true art. As he remembered in his memoirs about Moscow in 1960s and 70s, he invested a few years into making a masterpiece, as he called it, a big classical painting, which he could not complete for quite a long time. He worked a lot in plein air, he changed the composition of this painting. He was trying until the point when he finally came up with a solution. He realized that in his contemporaneity, making a big classical painting as a utopian project, which is impossible to complete. In his sketches of the beginning of the 60s, he experiments a lot with different structures of drawings and paintings. And he used to think about the nature of painting. What is painting? Is it a window into the world? Is it a kind of a manifestation of the being? Is it an image of the being? Is it a projection of one's personal experience? And these thoughts gave birth to a whole number of characteristic works of his, including the series with circles. Formally, what we see here is abstraction. Lines, squares done in black pencil, and circles. Bright circles, most often yellow or red. It seems that they indicate the key points in these compositions. At some point, one might think that what we see in front of us is a kind of a skeleton of an academic painting, which got rid of the whole layer of colors, of oils, and what is retained here is the compositional structure of the canvas, the lines of interaction between different characters. And it's curious that this abstraction, pretty much like the whole series, spheres or circles, unfolds in a classical canvas. It has the upper and the lower part. It has the right and the left part. At the same time, we can see that this image is devoid of any objects. Finally, as Ilya Kabakov remembers himself in his book, discovered his own path. It came to him when he was making a series titled Shower. It would seem that this is the simplest narrative. A naked man stands in the shower, and it seems that there is nothing more banal, there is nothing more trivial, I would even say, than just a person standing in the shower in the mornings. And the narrative that we see here is not just banal. I would say that it's uncommon for the Soviet painting and graphics because it shows a very intimate moment in the life of this person. It shows the vulnerability of this person in the face of the artist. The artist captures, invades this scene. In this series, we can see a miracle happen in every drawing. And the miracles happen not with the figure of the man standing in the shower, but with what happens with the pouring water. Sometimes it can turn into a stream that no longer looks like a shower directed downwards because of gravity. It turned out that with a number of constants, a scene of a person standing in the shower can turn into anything, a surrealist drawing, an illustration to a textbook, anything. This series marked a huge step. It showed that to be contemporary, to be in touch with contemporaneity, one does not have to take a privileged stance of an observer that lifts their reality up to his or her level, leaving the everyday world. It's not necessary to see the spiritual in the everyday. Kabakov shows the opposite. All unofficial artists and the modernism of the dissidents was very serious, was very grave. All the artists were thinking about eternity, about avoiding the everyday life. But it's something that really reminded one of the ideologies of social realism, when artists were called upon to portray the heroic actions of a Soviet person. Ilya Kabakov begins to move in an opposite direction at the beginning of the 60s. What inspires him is the Dada laugh. He intentionally works with very trivial matters. very pragmatic, or on the contrary, they are overly uplifted. Another very important work here is Cubes 1962. Here we see certain characteristic features which we'll find in later works by Ilya Kabakov. What we see here are pieces of wood. What is used here also is orgolite, and what we see on top are just the usual cubes that we find in every household that has children. And only two of these cubes are adorned with a landscape of a very common place near Moscow. This is something that Kabakov discovers for himself. It's something that he failed to find in the European modernism, in nonconformist Soviet traditions of the first generation. That's infantile game with the material, disdain for quality, and something like mockery. He mocks the audience. The audience comes expecting something uplifting, something exciting, but what they see in front of them are just toys. And it's important that in these works, Kabakov, it looks like he intentionally sets the question whether what we see in front of us is a work of art. Where are the boundaries between art and non-art? If we qualify it as an artwork, why do we do that? Because of what? We see the same features in Kabakov's works from the beginning of the 60s. For example, in this amazing work titled Boy. It's a piece of orgolite fiberboard with paste on top. This is a very grotesque image of a small boy as a kind of an image. It is modeled not only with the paint. What we can see is also an overimposed pattern. This is, of course, a parody for the Vitruvian person, the symbol of the Renaissance, which places a human being in the center of the world, turning humans into the measure of all things. For Ilya Kabakov, this boy, of course, does not really live up to the ideals of beauty of the Renaissance. This boy is much closer to our everyday reality, and it rhymes with the fates of people in the 20s. People are miserable, people are prone to sins, the world is imperfect. Whatever perfect grids you impose on the world, it remains imperfect. Another very important work of that time is right here on the screen. It's titled Gun and Chickens. It looks like it's done from cement. It looks like a block, like a piece of wall. Actually, the material here is papier-mâché. We see AK-47 gun on top. Below, we have two images of small chickens. As Kabakov himself wrote elsewhere about this work, it was important for him to show that figurative painting cannot be detached from the context it was born from. And the prototype for this were the fences that he saw around him in the urban landscape. with different inscriptions written on them. This fence, a part of the urban landscape, is presented here for the audience. The color used here is very common, was very common at that point. It was used everywhere for fences. As for the chickens, Kabakov's interpretation is quite naive. He says that the gun means a threat for life, and these chickens are hiding. They are hiding from this threat of this militarist device. This is a very childish, very funny artistic object. Of course, only a few dozens people ever saw it, only those who visited Kabakov's workshop. Many were at a loss when seeing it, thinking that it's a caricature, thinking that it's too simple, it's too plain. But for Kabakov, it was an essential work. And here I'm showing an excerpt from the memoirs written in the 80s. Kabakov describes here the transition that he experienced, that transition from the naive period of his art when he was a student, when he was a mentee, an apprentice, the transition towards him being an artist, him coming up with his own unique works. He says here that he made a few small paintings on plywood that he found next to his workshops. The texture of this plywood became part of the painting. And it turned out that the surfaces that he used were all integrated into the painting, but they were not real paintings with a capital P. They were remains of everyday life, something miserable, something small, remains of everyday life that are somehow rearranged into a funny order that are trying to look better. And this turned out to be the absurd, miserable thing that Kabakov was actually looking for. From then on, he starts using the words an art piece, not a painting. For him, it is not about representing the world. It is about attributing meanings to the world. This creative journey was very similar to that of Kazimir Malevich, and I think that Dada kind of rejection of figurative art, of art as a sacred practice, rhymes a lot with Malevich's series of 1913, 1915, and the same is true for Ilya Kabakov's works in mid-60s. And personally for me, him going back to the Dadaist tradition in the local art, in Russian art, is very important. Here, Kabakov rethinks the heritage of Russian avant-garde in a completely new context. What's more, he is using completely different theoretical foundations. The work that you can see here, a pipe, a stick, a ball, a fly, deals with the reality that can mutate. we see here a transition from one object to another. What we see here are real objects, modeled objects, painted objects. They are all located. They're all placed on a glossy orgolite. This is the technique that Kabakov uses a lot. Ever since the 60s, he stopped using canvas a lot. He preferred glossy surfaces. The surface seems to deny its artistic nature, but at the same time, it reminds one of the eternity of suprematists. For Malevich, it was full of something both mystical and foolish at the same time. The very matter of the space in the painting, just like for Eric Bulatov, is very important for Ilya Kabakov. Ilya Kabakov argues a lot about the nature of the painting with Steinbeck, with Vladimir Yankelevsky, his close friend. He keeps thinking about what it is. Is it just an empty surface that the artist has to fill with something? Or is it a radiating fullness? Is it something that exists and emanates? And it requires from Kabakov and for many other artists just to make it visible. Vladimir Favorsky, for example, insisted on such a perspective. Ilya Kabakov kept changing theories. He experimented a lot. He tried different takes, different approaches. And he shows that all of these spaces can penetrate each other, the emerging space of the painting and the existing space of the painting. The work you see on the screen is called Death of the Dog Called Ali. It's made from 2 pieces of orgolite. This is the work titled A Case in Priozorsk. You can see a flying train. And this miracle of levitation shields everyday life from us. Production of art is full of miracles indeed. Ilya Kabakov states that art also has some space for this levitation, like in Steinbeck's objectless compositions, where the painter was rethinking Malevich's heritage. And the same is true for works by Kabakov, like this one, titled Bublik or Bagel. What we see here is a dialogue with Steinbeck's spaces. Again, this work is executed on orgolite. The surface here is bleached, and Kabakov paints 4 silhouettes on it. He calls it head with ears. And every silhouette that we see here, again, as Kabakov explained it, can mean anything, literally anything. Even 4 different temperaments that people may have. But first of all, what matters is that these are flat contours, flat figures that are placed on top of the deep white space of the painting. And they draw our attention to the fact that this painting has a surface. There are other interventions here in the composition, a small fragment of a landscape, a walking person ahead of a boy, and the bagel. This is the superficial that will always be present in any painting, however sacred or however spiritual it may be. Although contemporaries reproached Kabakov of being so ironic about the nature of painting. Although he was reproached of being too sarcastic in the devices that he used. What mattered for Kabakov himself was to break free from the tradition that set the pedestal for art. He wanted to avoid art being seen as something unworldly, and he wanted to avoid a status of a creator himself. He didn't want to create eternal, timeless art. For Kabakov, one of the main goals of this period is to get rid of the perspective on the painting as an object on the wall, as something that can be used for decoration purposes, as something that can be purchased and sold. Kabakov, like avant-garde painters of the beginning of the 20s, deliberately goes against the characteristics that could make his artwork more valuable on the market. What he needed for that, it was not enough to make the works that we have seen, like a gun and chickens or reproducing the objects of reality. It's not enough just to make high art more profane. Ilya Kabakov goes further. What matters for him is making a grid that would structure the image according to the laws which he wanted to use to systematize the whole world. This is how a whole series of drawings came about, and some monumental works. They look like tables. Here on the screen, you can see one of the earlier examples of this series. It's called The Answers of the Experimental Group, 1968. It shows us a very conditional image of the world. It seems that the world is literally represented, and every piece is identified. It has to be identified by a scientist from this experimental group that has to verify the reality. Is this a real pipe or Sapasian peep, like in Magritte's painting? Where is the end of authenticity? Where do lies begin? Where is the end of high art? And where do we begin the work of an engineer who just represents some image that will further on will be executed in production lines? Here is another example, Untitled, 1970. It looks like a random test due to the will of the fly, the artist, the audience, the artificial intelligence. We can gather sentences from the words shown here. 3 words I've highlighted. A doggo wanna sleep. If we think about the further on late of contemporary art, here we can confirm after Holupetsky, after the quote I showed at the beginning of the talk, that Kabakov was the first to go away from the image of an artist as a god, as a creator. He shows that an artist is a kind of a clinicist of civilization. these are the tools that matter the most for Ilya Kabakov when he creates this work. Currently, it's held in the collection of the Tretyakov Gallery. This work is attributed differently when now it is thought to be done in 1970 or 71, although initially the date was 1972. Andrei Monastyrsky, one of the successors of Kabakov, in his register of key works by the Moscow Conceptual Art School, this work is indicated as the first one that laid the foundation for the Moscow Conceptualist School. What we see here in front of us is something that looks like a painting. It is rectangular, it is colored, and it is hanging on the wall, like all the paintings. But actually, if we look closely, we will see that it's not a painting. I will show you a fragment of this work. Here it is. We can see cells here, cells of different colors. And in every cell, we can see a statement by this or that person with a name attributed. All the phrases are about somebody who's spoken about in third-person singular, male gender. I think he will never be back. I saw him on the street yesterday. I wish I knew that he... Of course, it's not about any specific character. It's about splitting the world into phenomena that come together in the words said by the experimental group. What is thus created is the polyphonic world with a lot of objects in it. A green fence, different streets like Sretenka, and so on and so forth. A lot of different creatures and a lot of different phenomena that can be described and that do not have to be depicted. The answers of the experimental group are exactly about it. As Kabakov used to tell Boris Groys later on in one of their conversations, it's really difficult to trust an image because it's too totalitarian. And literally text gives a bigger space for images and for imagination. What can be created here are imaginary phantoms of a quasi-real world. Thus, this table, the table that reproduces different voices, human voices, is much bigger, is much more comprehensive than a composition with a lot of characters in it, which Kabakov failed to complete in the 50s. In the 70s, Ilya Kabakov comes close to one of his main discoveries. It has to do with his rethinking the status of a painting as such. At that time, the art scene saw the rise in performative practices. At the beginning of the 70s, Ilya Kabakov starts to come up with his albums, and the first series was titled 10 Characters. In it, every one of the characters seems to be a projection of Kabakov's socio-pathological properties. As a very talented person, as a very smart person, Kabakov was a sociopath, of course, and it was very difficult for him to be part of the Soviet society, and it didn't really matter where he went. Was that people queuing to get bread or the office of the main editor of this or that magazine? He was very frustrated in everyday life, and this frustration for him was the ground for dissecting these phobias. This is where the 10 characters came from. Every one of them is traumatized in their existence. The first one is Primakov, closeted Primakov. This is the character that has spent his whole life in the closet. Sitting there, he's observing the darkness all his life. Boris Groys, a philosopher, a theoretician, says that this is the inner space of the black square. The closeted Primakov was actually represented in Malevich's canvas. So this is a kind of a cutout from the black square. And it doesn't really matter what happens behind the doors of the closet. A person that spends all his life in the darkness sees the same dark space. This character inhabits the world where what exists is only sound and, of course, his imagination. Sometimes Primakov peeps out of the closet and sees his mother's room. Sometimes he opens the doors, but it doesn't really mean anything because the real reality is toxic and dangerous for him. And like 10 other characters, at the end of this story, Primakov disappears from the family. The family loses track of him, as it says here in the comment of his mother, we assume. The character stopped opening the door to the closet for 3 days. Nobody could hear a sound. Whatever be said, he never responded. His father and I decided to break the door, but when we did so, there was nobody in there. This is not death. It is disappearance from the world. The disappearance that becomes the end to the life of a human being, the only dream of whom is to go beyond the visible. Kogan, in this comment, describes Primakov's state as the state of subconscious nominalist. Primakov can't see the reality, but when he looks out of his closet, he sees only words instead of things. These are the projections of his imagination, the ones that cannot be replaced with anything, because we learn to see only with the experience of seeing. It says here, fresh carrots. The words are written on the carrot-colored background, and it can tell us more about carrots than a depiction of it. These words say strong wind, and these words may indicate to us the experience much more vividly than just an image. The album is completed with the words which are very important for the background of the life of this generation. Only the soul locked up and surrounded on all sides by darkness, can dream with such force of sun-drenched distances of an endless horizon. It rises smoothly and disappears into the blue sky. My colleagues told me today, well, we're looking forward to your talk. You're going to tell us who came up with the genre of an album first. But I will tell you straight away that I won't take such responsibility. I think it's pretty obvious that these are motifs that can be found in the legacies of different artists. What we saw at that time was an extensive exchange of ideas. And I think that these creative solutions were discussed at length. In 1971, around the same year when Kabakov was getting ready to make his album titled Closeted Primakov, Janovsky's cartoon titled Closet was released. And another image that we have to remember here is the image of a box that contemporary people are confined to. And we see again this character disappear into eternity. I mean here Vladimir Yankelevsky's door. This is the embodiment of this human being that is locked in a box but finds a way out into an immaterial dimension. This is another work from the same series, 10 characters, Archipov looking into the window. It was about a person who was observing the world through the window, which can be opened, semi-closed, and closed. And at some point, the character starts to confuse the reality that is outside and one that is inside. His eyes find different objects on the surface of the glass. And I believe that these works should remind us of Chukhov's works. The story of Archipov that looks out of the window also ends with a disappearance. We can see the wings of seraphims appear in the window. They flew to reveal to Archipov the reality of the being. They shut off the world from Archipov with their snow-white wings, and they take him to another world. This is the world that we can observe while staying in the closet, looking into the darkness, or as we look out into the window. Both of these narratives, anyway, end up with the disappearance, with a flight. In 1995, a Czech art historian and curator Milena Slavitska organized a big show of the Moscow Conceptual Art School, which was called Flight Disappearance. When one compares the works of the 70s and the 80s, one can see that this motif is indeed featured in many artworks. This is another album, Portrait Surikov. It shows another pathology of a contemporary artist. This artist cannot see the world as a whole. He can see it as torn apart only. And here I want to remind you of Vladimir Yankelevsky's works, where we can see the same torn reality, ripped reality. And it seems like the reality is destroyed into smaller pieces, which do not coexist in harmony. In 1974, when Kabakov's art was on its peak, what happened in Moscow was the so-called bulldozer exhibition, organized by non-conformist artists of the first generations. It was shut down, and it led to the ideological authorities rethinking the cultural scene and rethinking the position of the unofficial artists. Soon, their position is legalized. They become legal. This is another show that happened 2 weeks after the bulldozer exhibition in the Izmailovo Park. It was open for 4 hours, but a few thousand audience members came to see it. But during this show, gathered a group including Ilya Kabakov and Viktor Pivovarov. They are very recognizable here. They called themselves non-aligned. Their take on the culture was different. They saw the contemporary culture for them as the one organized not through the capitalist perspective of selling and producing, but through the totalitarian perspective of controlling everything. They decided not to join the exhibition, but to keep working for themselves, staying in a very small circle of those that value this art and that are ready to engage in a serious conversation with the artists. In this picture, you can see Mikhail Odnoralov, one of the activists of the community of graphics, who, like Oscar Rabin, was trying to make non-conformist arts become legal. Here he is trying to convince Ilya Kabakov to take part in the second legal exhibition in Moscow. The second exhibition was going to be held in the beekeeping pavilion at Vdnh. If you look at Ilya Kabakov, you see a very characteristic smile on his face. It seems that he is saying, I'm not ready to exhibit my works. And indeed, he stayed out of it. And he forever, as Alexei Yurchak said, it was forever until it ended. And likewise, Ilya Kabakov forever shut himself up in his workshop. He invited only friends to his workshop. He showed his works to them only. So his way of existing was about staying on the edge. For him, it is not only his social stance, but it is the essential question of what is emptiness, what is void, and how can one work with void as the artistic surface. By the way, this is another album, also from the 10 Characters series. It was called the Adorno Maligin. The character of this album had a very characteristic feature. He never came out to the middle of a dancing room or of any space. He moved along the walls only, running from one corner to the next. He was afraid to find himself in the locus of production of the power of speech, the power over other people, and he wanted to avoid finding himself in the middle, which is the locus of entropy too. An empty page for Ilya Kabakov is the space where the artist cannot see himself in. This place is dangerous. Kabakov highlights the emptiness of the powerful middle, of the powerful center. He's striving to avoid falling into it, but at the same time, this entropic void of the invisible power of language turns out to be productive void too. So we can see two interpretations here: emptiness as absence and emptiness as fullness. Ilya Kabakov worked with the topic of emptiness later on in some of his key works, including a number of works titled Along the Edge. This is a huge 3-meter long piece. It's a piece of rogolite, which is 3 meters high, covered with a glossy surface with glossy enamel. A little Moldavian boy, Gugutse, is walking along its edge. Walking along the edge, being on the margins of the mainstream, was Ilya Kabakov's social stance and his take on the problem of the center as the place of production of powerful statements. This is the culmination of these works, 1985, called An Empty Painting. We can't see anything but emptiness here. In the scheme for all artworks, Ilya Kabakov here outlines all of his series, all of his works, placing them on different levels. They can be read top down or from left to right. From top down, we can see the growth of entropy, the growth of whiteness, of emptiness. And from it, we move to the fullness, having a lot of rubbish, a lot of everything on the painting. And another extreme here are his text-based paintings. In this sense, the entropy of the growing void can be filled with certain tools, the tools that Kabakov finds to save this reality from being frozen. One of the pieces here is the schedule of taking the rubbish out. Of course, this is one of the grids described by Rosalind Krauss, the metaphysical grids that burst out of the painting, the meanings that are beyond the painting. Weirdly, Kabakov, like many other Moscow-based conceptual artists, managed to combine very profane things with deep existential meanings, something that every Soviet person experiences. The schedule for taking the rubbish out is 5 years old, and that rhymes with the 5-year-old plans that Soviet people lived by, but nobody knew whether they will see the end of the 5-year period. Well, Eric Bulatov, one of the sources of inspiration, was the aesthetics of railway posters, as we discussed. For Kabakov, these are Soviet propaganda stands. They were installed both in public environments and at production facilities with a very harsh aesthetics. It was about formatting the environment that Soviet people found themselves in. They became the prototypes, or maybe on the contrary, the opposites to another series by Ilya Kabakov. Here he works with the principle of creating the framework for the painting with the words. It's called Whose Fly It Is. And different characters talk to each other about it. Is it the fly of Pyotr Mikhailovich Bochkovoi? Another character answers it may be so. Everybody who lived in the Soviet Union hated flies. Only cockroaches were worse. But at the end, here this fly becomes part of the blue sky, and it remains here in Kabakov's painting. Here is another object, very common for the Soviet lifestyle. A grater. But it is not just any grater. It's not just a number of objects that inhabitants of communal apartments use. It's much bigger than that. Kabakov works with these objects, works with them as elements of a huge set of devices. And his goal here is to outline the boundaries of the Soviet reality, to show it not through huge compositions with different figures, but to use tables, lists, identities. His final work in the series is this installation of 1991, and it reminds one very much about this propaganda stand, which was his inspiration for the series, the information stand. This aesthetics, after surviving the dark days trauma of the disruption of beauty, returns on a new modernist level as a memory about how beautiful that world and that time could be. Like this bug. It is one in a huge number of paintings by Kabakov in late 80s, early 90s. Their aesthetics is again akin to Soviet illustrations, to Soviet paintings. However, in this case, we can see that Kabakov is in a different phase of interaction between the text and the image. There is a gap between the text and the image, and this is where the meaning emerges, which matters for the artist. I hope that everybody here has turned 18. Everybody here is of age. This gap exists also in graphics, in paintings, and it doesn't really matter what is depicted, be that a bug or a key into the supermarket. The words imposed on it are detached somehow from the image. They do not merge with the image. And what is found in between is the emptiness, is the void, and the author or the reader fills it up. The author relies here on the audience, and this is a new concept of interacting with the audience members. This dialogue with the audience finds its culmination in 3D installations one of the first special works by Kabakov is the installation you see on the screen, 16 ropes, 1984. He executed it in his workshop. On the eye level, there were 16 ropes. To every one of them, a huge number of small objects was tied. Tickets, pencils, anything. Rubbish that is normally thrown away during cleaning. But for Kabakov, this rubbish becomes a kind of a catalog of entities. The entities that become the foundation of everyday life of a human being, just like the fly on the painting we have seen before. Here, all objects in the installation all objects are just items from the huge space of the Soviet world. To show the nature of the conceptualist community, the fact that they lived as hermits, Kabakov made other works. This is a photo taken when friends came to see Kabakov and to see one of his exotic works. It's an exotic work, nothing like what was seen before in the circle. Here in the middle, Ilya Kabakov constructed a completely closed space where a visitor can only peep in. This is what Yelena Yelagina and Andrei Monastyrsky are doing in the picture. And what one sees inside is an interior, a bit poor, to put it mildly, but that has everything necessary: a bed, a chair, walls covered in Soviet posters, and in the corner a table with a mock-up of Moscow, of the Moscow landscape. And what we can see here too are 3D trajectories of a flight of something. We don't know what it was. Maybe this is something that was launched here under the ceiling of this poor room. We also see here a structure which is like a catapult. Maybe this is the device that the person used to leave his poor lodging, to go again beyond the material world, to go somewhere else where there is no poverty, no misunderstandings, and no darkness. This motif is very Soviet to a certain extent, but as the fate of the installation showed, this image was quite universal, the image of a person who leaves the physical world and wants to embrace the real freedom. After Perestroika, this installation was reproduced all around the world in different museums. Installations of Kabakov, however strange they might seem in the 80s, were ahead of their time. They played a very important role in the reconstruction of the global art practices. And they played a very important role in the fate of Kabakov himself. Another big work of his, called A Box with Litter, 1986, one can say that this is the continuation of his 16 ropes. Every item here is labeled with swear words, and it illustrates the speech rubbish, the language rubbish that exists in our language. It also illustrates how poor the everyday life was. A small person who is crushed by the everyday life, and this person becomes the main character for many of Kabakov's works. In 1988, Ilya Kabakov shows his first big installation, 10 characters, which Ronald Feldman Fine Arts. He changes some of the narratives for this show. This is not an exhibition of paintings, as was customary just a few years before. Painting in the Western world was thought to be the queen of arts, and it dominated in exhibition practices. Instead, he creates a kind of a total art space where everything matters. This is not exhibition design. This is a part of narrative. Every item is part of narrative. Ilya Kabakov's installations turn out to be the form very relevant for contemporary art at the moment of its crisis, when the whole art structure all around the world had to change. Private foundations, private galleries give way to huge institutions, centers of contemporary art, museums of contemporary art, huge forms of contemporary art, different biennials, triennials, and so on and so forth. Installations allow the artist to use these spaces as efficiently as possible. I mean, the white cubes of the galleries, huge white cubes. Kabakov indeed becomes one of the top artists globally. The Art Forum magazine called him artist #1 globally in 1993. Ilya Kabakov's installations and his theory of total installation, which he told at different conferences where he was invited as a theorist of contemporary art, of course, is worthy of this status in the world. In his first installations that were shown in the West, Ilya Kabakov shows the efficiency of his project-based thinking, which he began in the 60s. What I mean here? To feel the work, one does not have to execute it completely. A lot of projects that were built in the 90s were designed in the 70s or in the 80s. For example, The Life of Flies, that tells the story of a fly civilization, is an example, or The Album of My Mother. But what produced a huge impression was the Noma installation. It was shown in Hamburg's Kunsthalle during the art fair. It was the art fair of Russian art and Eastern European art. Looking at these drafts, and I could take any other drawing, not necessarily this one. I could take anything else from the heritage of Ilya Kabakov. Looking at these pictures, looking at these drafts, and if one compares the drafts and the works that were actually implemented and executed, it is easy to understand that it wasn't possible to implement every of these designs in real life. So these spaces were mentally designed by the artist. They were executed, they were built and constructed not by the artist himself, but by the institutions that volunteered to do so. So as an artist, Kabakov does not hold all of the power in his hands here. He does not have to. He prefers to delegate some of the decisions to those that do the production. At the same time, one has to say that Ilya was very particular about, for example, the walls being the right color. He wanted the furniture to be of certain quality. People who observed his communication with the German workers that worked at Documenta in Kassel, he was making the workers making the corners uneven, and it was torturous because it went beyond the understanding of German conscientious construction workers. So Norma, it looks like a big circle divided into 14 cells. In the middle, we can see a big circle that emanates light. It is like the eternity looking down at small cells, small workplaces, and every one of these cells is dedicated to one of the apostles of the Moscow conceptual circle. Ilya Kabakov is among them as a character of his own narrative. Boris Groys, Andrei Monastyrsky, Joseph Backstein, Lev Rubinstein, Dmitry Prigov. And these are either hospitals or psychiatric wards or something else. And they all tell about the collective body, which happens to overcome the system, making the artistic world discursively free from the Soviet totalitarian pressure, the aggressive control, the desire to be exhibited at the official Soviet platforms. A very characteristic story that I would like to quote to end this narrative about Ilya Kabakov is one of my favorite anecdotes. And I think it's very telling about the artist and about the time itself, the generation that he belonged to, the time he lived in. When Jean-Pierre Martin decided to invite Kabakov to exhibit some of his works in Switzerland, he went through a number of stages of negotiating this work, and the Ministry of Culture of the Soviet Union finally allowed the work to be taken abroad. A big truck came to Moscow from Switzerland to take these works, and it turned out that none of these works, not the bug, not the kitchen series, cannot leave the workshop space. It was literally impossible to extract them from the workshop because the door was too small and the staircase was very small too. It became obvious that the artist, for many decades, was not working for them. He was working for himself. And it turned out that this is the best way to create a comprehensive artistic narrative. something that can serve as a kind of a sample for us of how intellect, together with artistic talent, can create a very fruitful, a very rich life journey. And it was indeed so rich that we don't have enough time now for the second character to talk. So the next time I will try to complete my today's narrative. I will turn to Viktor Pivovarov, who I originally wanted to talk about today, but for now he will stay out of the frame. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. I'm really sorry that I didn't have enough time to talk about Viktor Pivovarov, but I'm sure we will catch up. Good evening. Thank you very much. It was so interesting, so rich. What happened to the truck thing at the end? The workshop had one window with a wooden frame that was quite long. They had to take the window out. So they had to use a wrench, a pulling hoist, to take all the works out. No questions? If I remember it correctly, in New York's Guggenheim, there was an exhibition, Russia, which ended with Kabakov's staircase into the sky. Do you think that was the culmination of the 20th century? Well, this is a personal take on the history of Russian art by the curators that made that exhibition on behalf of Russia. And somewhere in between all of the works that the exhibition began with and ended with, there were so many things, there were so many items. I think the exhibition could be completely different, to be honest. But the fact that it started with a Byzantine icon, with a Russian icon, I think it was just logical to make this transition into the space of new sacred, which is present in the Moscow Conceptualist School. It's no accident that Boris Groys titled his famous article Moscow Romantic Conceptualism, showing that unlike positivists of the Western tradition, Soviet conceptual artists, Moscow-based conceptual artists are mystics. And beyond the surface of things, they see a hidden nature. And as he wrote ironically in the introduction to this article, it is impossible to make any abstraction in Russia without a reference to Favorsky. So the line that the curators of that exhibition titled Russia, I think, is very relevant, although it could be different. I forgot to say that the heads, that the faces of these exhibitions were the Popkovs, those that constructed the gas. I think this is just an ideological hook, kind of, that was used for marketing purposes. Of course, other narratives were possible. So I think Popkov's work was chosen not to juxtapose him with the angels, it was the opposite, I think. I think they wanted to show that according to the curators, the Soviet painting of the 20th century, although it was really damaged by the ideology of conceptualism, still was akin to the Russian avant-garde and to the Russian conceptualist art. And they showed it through Popkov's work, showing that even official Soviet paintings could be very spiritual. I have another question. You talked about philosophers that influenced the previous three artists. As for Kabakov, what were his influences? Would those be post-structuralists, Derrida, Deleuze? Let me put it this way, and I think it relates to your first question. For Western conceptualists, the key text from the philosophy of the 20th century was Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein treatise. And for the Moscow conceptualists, that was rather Heidegger. Of course, many texts were not translated into Russian, or those translations were not available, and that had its own influence. However, there was a tradition of retelling each other the essence of different books they read. The circle included not only other artists, but also philosophers. People who knew languages translated different texts on their own. When Boris Groys entered the community, he followed contemporary philosophy and he translated texts all the time. He shared digests of those texts. So through him, many texts became available to the local artistic community. However, I think that structuralism and post-structuralism were not that popular at that time. Although, of course, one can see that the Tartu school, Bakhtin's theory, Losev's philosophy really influenced the art. I mean, the Russian, the Soviet philosophers and theoreticians that were working in the Russian context. I think what you showed and what you commented on really works well with the post-structuralist theory, like looking at the other side of the total narrative. Surprisingly, artists sometimes draw conclusions, without having access to the theoretical texts. And it is something that is manifested in conversations between Groys and Kabakov. Groys's philosophical arguments are contrasted with the very down-to-earth statements made by Ilya Kabakov. I think that his epiphanies did not have anything to do with philosophy or with theory. It was about his own need to make some organic gestures, but not through theories, but sometimes through absurdist practices. Thank you very much. By the way, when I met Emilia Kabakov and Ilya Kabakov in 2009, they came to Garage to make a big exhibition, to make a big show. They were complaining a lot that the contemporary art world has lost a sense of humor. So I will reiterate on that. I think that this Dada kind of factor, absurdist, humorous, was very important It was just as important as the opposite, almost theological arguments put forward about the eternity.
Да, их несколько штук, они находятся у нас в библиотеке. Выходили, ну, и в 90-е годы была книжка, изданная от Маргина, позднее. Вообще на Кабакову посвящено очень много текстов, не только Гройса, поэтому призываю вас погрузиться в наши полки.
Спасибо, обязательно